At 16 minutes past 8 in the morning, the radio station in Hiroshima went dead. In Tokyo, an operator reached for another line. That one was dead too. Then the military circuits, then the telegraph cut somewhere just north of the city. A place where hundreds of thousands of people had been walking to work had, in the space of a single minute, simply stopped answering. A staff officer was put on a plane and told to find out why. He was still 100 miles out when he saw it, a column of smoke standing taller than anything he had ever flown beside. He circled lower and lower and could not understand what he was looking at. Where a city should have been, there was only a burning scar on the earth. He had no word for it. Neither did the men waiting for him in Tokyo, and in the days that followed, those men would face a question no army had ever been made to answer. Not how to win the war, that was already lost, but how to make themselves believe it. By the summer of 1945, the men who governed Japan were not strangers to ruin. They had watched it arrive, city by city, for the better part of a year. In March, in a single night, fire had swept through Tokyo and killed some close to 100,000 people. This is an estimate, but the scale of it is not in doubt. Homes of paper and wood had burned faster than families could run through the streets, and the fire had made its own wind, pulling the living into the flames. That was one night in one city. By summer, more than 60 cities had been scorched from the map, their factories gutted, their harbors sealed. American aircraft had sown the sea lanes with mines, and American submarines had closed the rest until the islands that had once ruled an ocean could no longer feed themselves. Almost nothing came in. Almost nothing went out. Okinawa had fallen in June after 12 weeks of slaughter that left the Americans in no doubt about the price of invading Japan itself. Fuel was nearly gone. Rice was running short. In the villages, women and children were being drilled to meet the coming invasion with sharpened bamboo poles, because there were not enough rifles to go around. So when the first reports of a terrible explosion in Hiroshima began to reach Tokyo, the instinct of the high command was not panic. It was doubt. These men had seen what bombs could do. They had counted their dead in the tens of thousands before and gone on fighting. What they could not do on the morning of the 6th of August was make the numbers add up. One plane, one bomb, and an entire city that would no longer answer. To understand the men waiting for that report, you have to understand that they had already been at war with each other for weeks. Japan in these final days was ruled by an inner circle of 6. Its formal name was the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War. History would come to know them simply as the Big Six. There was the Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro, 77 years old. A retired admiral who 9 years earlier had been shot several times by rebel officers in an attempted coup, left for dead on the floor of his own home, and had somehow lived. There was the foreign minister, Togo Shigenori, 62, a career diplomat who had come to believe, quietly and completely, that the war was already lost, and who had taken his post only on the understanding that his true task was to find a way out of it. And there was the Navy minister, Honai Mitsumasa, 65, a former prime minister himself, who had reached that same grim conclusion long before, and who said very little about it in the open, because in that room in that year, to say such a thing aloud could get a man killed. Then there were the 3 soldiers. Anami Korechika, the war minister, 58 years old, a general who had commanded in the field before he was called back to Tokyo. The strongest voice in all of Japan for fighting on. Umezu Yoshijiro, chief of the Army General Staff. Toyoda Sumu, chief of the Navy General Staff. 3 men who believed down to the bone that surrender was not the same as defeat, that surrender was extinction, that a nation which laid down its arms had already ceased to be a nation at all, and that it was better by far to perish with honor than to live in shame. 3 favored finding a way to end the war, while 3 remained committed to continued resistance. Their division was already deep, although it had not yet hardened into the exact 3-against-3 deadlock that would paralyze the government on August 9. Above them all sat the Emperor Hirohito, 44 years old. Under the Meiji Constitution, Hirohito formally held sovereign authority, supreme command of the armed forces, and the power to declare war and make peace. In practice, he usually exercised that authority through his ministers and military leaders, making his direct intervention in the surrender debate politically extraordinary. Close beside him stood his most trusted advisor, the keeper of the Privy Seal, Marquis Kido Koichi, 56, who spent these weeks moving quietly between the two factions, searching for a path out of the war that would not end with the peacemakers murdered by their own army. The argument between all of them came down, in the end, to a single sheet of paper, the Potsdam Declaration. Weeks before, on the 26th of July, the Allies had laid down their terms. Surrender, they said, or face what they called prompt and utter destruction. It was, in its way, a final warning, though no one in Tokyo yet knew how literally it was meant. And here, before a single bomb had fallen, the tragedy had already begun to turn on a single word. When reporters pressed the Prime Minister on how his government would answer the declaration, Suzuki said that for now it would mokusatsu the Allied terms. It is a difficult word to carry across into another language. It can mean to withhold comment. It can mean to take no notice. It can also mean to treat with silent contempt, to kill a thing with silence. Suzuki's use of mokusatsu later became the subject of a translation controversy. But his full public statement indicated that Japan would disregard the declaration and continue the war, so it would be misleading to claim that so translated word closed an otherwise open path to surrender or directly caused the atomic bombing. So the peace faction was ready now to accept those Potsdam terms with one condition, only one, that the emperor be allowed to keep his throne. The soldiers wanted no foreign occupation of the home islands, or as little as could be managed. Japan to disarm its own soldiers with its own hands. Japan to try its own men for the crimes of the war in its own courts, and the imperial line preserved above all. If the enemy refused, then they would fight the battle they had spent a year preparing, a last defense of the sacred homeland itself. They had a name for it, Ketsugo, the decisive operation. Millions of soldiers were still under arms across the empire. Millions of civilians were being made ready to die on the beaches of the home islands. Make the invasion bleed, the soldiers believed. Make it cost the enemy more than his people could stomach, and America would finally sit down and talk. It was not a plan for victory. By the summer of 1945, not even the hardest of them still dreamed of victory. It was a plan to lose slowly enough and bloodily enough to bargain. That was the deadlock in Tokyo, and into that deadlock, hour by hour, came the truth from Hiroshima. It did not come all at once. It came in fragments, each one stranger and worse than the last. Railway workers 30 miles from the city described a single cloud that had climbed higher than anything they had ever seen in the sky, a pillar that mushroomed at its crown. Patrols reported fires that spread outward not in scattered patches, the way an ordinary firebombing burns, but in a ring, a widening circle radiating from one point. And then the first survivors began to reach the edges of the ruin, and the doctor to examine them could not explain what they saw. Burns on only one side of the body, the side that had been turned toward the light. None of it fit. A firebombing scatters its damage across a city, wherever the bombs happen to fall. This was something entirely. This was a wound with a center. Everything inside a certain radius simply erased, and just beyond that line, the world still standing. There was no weapon in any manual in any army on Earth that could draw a circle like that on the ground. And there was one detail these men understood better than anyone alive. Hiroshima had not been an ordinary city. It had been a military city. The headquarters of the 2nd General Army had stood in its heart, under Field Marshal Hata Shunroku, one of the most senior officers in all of Japan. An entire regional command had been sitting almost at the center of that blast. By nothing more than the accident where he happened to be standing that morning, Hata himself survived. Many thousands of the men he commanded did not. In a single instant, the army had lost one of its own nerve centers, and it could not even explain how. For 16 hours was where the truth stopped. A silence they could not break, a destruction they could not name. And then the enemy named it for them. Some 16 hours after the bomb fell, in the small hours of the next morning, a report reached Tokyo from the men who monitored foreign radio. In Washington, the President of the United States had gone on the air, and Harry Truman had chosen his words to leave no room for doubt. The weapon that had fallen on Hiroshima, he told the entire world, was an atomic bomb. A harnessing, he called it, of the basic power of the universe. He said that its force was greater than 20,000 tons of ordinary explosive, delivered by a single aircraft, and he told them exactly what would come next. If Japan did not now accept the terms it had already been offered, it could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which had never been seen on this earth. All that first day, the most powerful men in Japan had refused to speak a single word. Now that word had crossed an ocean and come back to them in the voice of their enemy. Atomic. It was the one thing several of them had feared, and that none of them had been willing to say aloud. Because to say it was to admit something that no strategy could answer, that no defense could stop, that no sacrifice on any beach could undo. If one aircraft could erase a city in the time it takes to draw a breath, then every plan the soldiers had made was already ash. And the war they were still arguing over how to fight was, in a way that not one of them was yet ready to accept, already finished. Knowing a thing and admitting a thing are not the same, and in the days after Hiroshima, the Japanese army chose not to admit it. The word had come from the enemy. That, for the soldiers, was reason enough to distrust it. Truman was the adversary, and an adversary announces a miracle weapon for one reason above all others, to break the will of a people he cannot yet reach with his armies. The generals had spent 4 years studying the enemy's propaganda. They knew how it worked, and so in the offices of the War Ministry, a decision changed that had nothing to do with what was true and everything to do with what could still be survived. The full nature of what had happened to Hiroshima would not be spoken plainly to the nation. The newspapers were told to be careful. A new type of bomb, the reports would say. A powerful bomb, not the word Truman had used, not atomic. This was not stupidity. Understand that if you understand nothing else about these men, they were not fools clinging to a fantasy. They were professional soldiers staring into an abyss, and they knew that the moment the word atomic reached every home in Japan, the will to fight the last battle would drain out of the country like water through a broken hull. The whole plan for the defense of the homeland rested on a single belief, held by millions of ordinary people, that their sacrifice could still change the outcome. The truth about Hiroshima made that belief impossible. So the truth was held at arm's length one more day and then another. But a thing that is true does not wait for permission. And there was one man in Japan who could not be told to look away because he had spent his entire life looking directly at exactly this. His name was Nishina Yoshio, 54 years old, the finest nuclear physicist his country had ever produced. As a young man, he had studied in Europe in the laboratory of Niels Bohr himself, among the small circle of people on Earth who truly understood what the atom could be made to do. And for years, quietly on behalf of the Imperial Army, Nishina had led Japan's own effort to build precisely the weapon that now perhaps lay in the ashes of Hiroshima. Sit with the weight of that for a moment. The one man the High Command needed to tell them the truth was the same man who had tried and failed to give that weapon to Japan first. He knew better than anyone why his own project had come to nothing. Japan did not have the electrical power. It did not have the industry. It did not have the mountains of raw material the work demanded. He had told them in so many words years before that even for the Americans such a bomb was probably still a distant thing. Now he had to sit with the possibility that he had been wrong and that the price of his being wrong was a city and everyone in it. They sent him to see for himself. On the 8th of August, 2 days after the blast, Nishina flew toward Hiroshima with an army investigating team led by an intelligence general named Arisue Seizo. The trip had been delayed a full day, in part by a transport plane that would not start, and in part, it must be said, by a government that was in no great hurry to learn the answer it already dreaded. Even from the air, Nishina recognized signs consistent with an atomic explosion. After entering Hiroshima, he examined scientific evidence, including exposed photographic materials and radiation effects, and concluded that an atomic bomb had been used. He was one of Japan's leading nuclear physicists and one of the few men capable of making that judgment with authority. The investigation also helped reveal that the weapon's radiation could injure and kill people who had survived the initial heat and blast. Some survivors and relief workers who entered Hiroshima afterwards suffered from residual radiation exposure. Nishina later died of liver cancer in January 1951, but no direct connection between his illness and the Hiroshima investigation has been established. But even his verdict, delivered from within, did not move the men who most needed to be moved, because before it could force any decision, a second blow fell. And for many of the soldiers, it landed harder than the bomb. Through the spring and summer, Japan had clung to one last thread of hope, and it did not run toward Washington. It ran toward Moscow. The Soviet Union had signed a neutrality pact with Japan and was not yet at war with them. And so the men of the foreign ministry had spent their last reserves of energy in a quiet, almost desperate effort to persuade the Soviets to act as a go-between, to carry Japan's case to the Americans, and broker some peace short of total surrender. They had even prepared to send Prince Fumimaro Konoe, a former prime minister from one of Japan's highest-ranking noble families, to Moscow as a special envoy, if only the Soviets would receive him. It was thin. Looking back, it was almost certainly a fantasy, because in secret, at Yalta, the Soviets had already promised the Americans that they would enter the war against Japan within months of Germany's defeat. But it was the only road left that did not end in unconditional surrender, and Japan had been walking it with everything it had. On the night of the 8th of August, that road ended. The Soviet Union declared war, and within hours, in the darkness of the early morning of the 9th, the Red Army came across the borders of Manchuria in 3 great columns at once, from the west, from the east, from the north. More than 1.5 million soldiers, thousands upon thousands of tanks, artillery beyond counting. Against them stood the Kwantung Army, once the pride and the terror of the imperial forces, now a hollow shell, its best divisions and its heaviest weapons long since stripped away and shipped south to defend the home islands. It did not hold. It could not. Whole formations were surrounded before they could form a line. Commanders sent back messages that said in the plainest words a soldier can use that they could not stop what was coming. For the generals in Tokyo, this was a particular and personal kind of ruin. The bomb was a horror from the sky, distant, strange, almost beyond the reach of ordinary thought. But the Soviet invasion was something they understood in their bones. It was armies and steel and ground being lost by the mile, the oldest arithmetic of war, and the arithmetic was hopeless. And it carried a second terror, deeper than the loss of Manchuria. These were conservative men, guardians of a throne they held to be sacred, and to them the Soviet Union did not mean merely another enemy army. It meant communism. It meant the kind of revolution that, a generation before in another country, had dragged an emperor and his whole family into a cellar and shot them. An American occupation was a bitter thing to imagine, but a Soviet one, or a Soviet-inspired uprising at home, threatened the one thing these men placed above their own lives, the imperial line itself. And so, in these very hours, some of them began to grasp a terrible logic, that the surest way to save the throne from the Soviet might be to surrender quickly to the Americans instead. The last hope of a negotiated peace was gone, and now Japan faced not one overwhelming enemy but 2, closing in from opposite ends of the earth, with nothing left in the middle strong enough to hold either of them back. To this day, historians still argue over which blow truly broke Japan, the atomic bombs or the Soviet armies. What is not in dispute is that they fell within hours of one another, and that together they left the men in Tokyo with no ground left to stand on. It was into that ruin, on the morning of the 9th of August, that the Big Six at last came together to confront what had happened to Hiroshima, the news from Manchuria still arriving in fragments on the table before them. And for the first time in all their weeks of argument, they turned to the actual words of the Potsdam Declaration, and began to speak not of whether to end the war, but of the terms on which it might be ended. The division that surfaced there was the same one that had haunted them from the start, only now it was drawn in fine and terrible detail. The 3 who wanted peace, the Foreign Minister Togo, the Prime Minister Suzuki, the Navy Minister Yonai, were prepared to accept the Allies to terms with a single condition. Only one, that the imperial institution be preserved, that the emperor keep his throne. Everything else, occupation, disarmament, the judgment of the enemy upon Japan's soldiers, they were ready to swallow, because the alternative was the death of the nation itself. The 3 soldiers would not go so low. Anami and the 2 chiefs of staff, Umezu and Toyoda, demanded 3 conditions more. That Japan face little occupation, or none at all. That Japan disarm its own soldiers rather than surrender them to a foreign power. and that Japan try its own men for the crimes of the war before its own judges. To hand those things to the enemy was, in their eyes, not surrender but disgrace, a disgrace worse than death. And if the Americans refused these terms, then the soldiers were still ready to fight the final battle on the beaches and in the mountains of the home islands. Umezu made their case with the cold confidence of a professional. Yes, he admitted, the Soviet entry was unfavorable, but it did not, he insisted, undo the plan. The Soviets had vast armies and vast air power. This was true, but they had almost no ships. They could conquer Manchuria and Korea. They could not easily cross the sea to invade Japan itself. The decisive battle, Umezu argued, could still be fought at home and still be made so costly that the enemy would rather bargain than pay the price. Some military hardliners believed that a weapon so difficult to manufacture could exist only in very small numbers. Admiral Toyota, in particular, doubted that the United States possessed many atomic bombs, while Anami continued to insist that Japan could still fight a final battle on the home islands. This was the temper of the men who still refused to yield. And beyond the six in the wider circle of the high command, there were voices more extreme still. The admiral who had founded the kamikaze, the men who flew their aircraft deliberately into the enemy's ships, argued in these very days that Japan could not truly be defeated so long as it was willing to spend its own people without limit. Sacrifice 20 million Japanese lives, he said, in one final suicidal defense, and the nation would never fall. That was the arithmetic the peace faction was arguing against. Not cowardice, a readiness to spend the entire population as ammunition. The debate wore on through the morning, round and round, peace against war, one condition against four, and neither side gave an inch. And it was while they sat there, locked in that same deadlock they had carried for days, that the second blow fell. At 11:02 that same morning, while the six men argued over the fate of one ruined city, an aircraft called Boxcar opened its bomb bay over another. A second atomic bomb, a second blinding flash, a second column of smoke climbing over a second valley. This time above the southern port of the Kakakake, where the surrounding hills swallowed some of the blast even as the city's heart was torn out. Tens of thousands dead in an instant, and tens of thousands more marked to die slowly in the weeks to come. Nagasaki proved that Hiroshima had not been a single unrepeatable experiment, but it did not prove that the United States possessed a large stockpile, and Japan's still had no reliable way of knowing how many additional weapons existed, or how quickly another could be made ready. By any measure a Russian nation might use, the argument should have been finished. 2 cities gone in 3 days. A second great power marching into the empire, their own scientists confirming from within the ruins that the weapon was real and that it poisoned the very earth behind it. Every road out closed. And here is the thing hardest to believe, and yet the plainest fact of these days. Even now, the Big Six could not agree. Even now, with a second cloud rising over a second Japanese city as they spoke, the deadlock held. The peace faction pressed harder, because how could they not, saying what could no longer be denied, that to continue was national suicide, that every day the war went on now meant another city turned to ash for nothing at all. And the soldiers, Anami among them, still would not yield. Not because they believed Japan could win. By now, not even they believed that. But because they could not bring themselves to be the men who signed away everything the dead had died for. To surrender was to stand before 2 million widows and countless orphans and tell them that the sacrifice had meant nothing. Better, some hard part of them still insisted, to force one last terrible reckoning and make the enemy pay in blood for every yard of the sacred homeland, than to lay the sanction and accept the end. 3 for peace, 3 for war. The same deadlock, unmoved by the unimaginable. The hours dragged past with no resolution, and slowly it became clear to the men in that room that the machinery of their own government had failed. 6 of the most powerful figures in the empire, and they could not reach the single decision on which the survival of the nation now depended. Japan's wartime decision-making system depended upon consensus, and the 3 against 3 division left the government unable to produce a final decision. There was, in all of Japan, only one authority that stood above their deadlock, one voice that no soldier could refuse and no minister could overrule. And to turn to it meant breaking a silence far older than this war, older than any man alive in that room. Breaking the deadlock required the emperor to intervene directly in a political and military dispute, an extraordinary step within the conventions of modern imperial government. To decide, it was Kido and Suzuki who opened the door. The keeper of the Privy Seal and the old admiral had spent these final days doing quietly, behind the scenes, what the deadlock made impossible in the open. They went to the emperor. Kido and Suzuki arranged a formal imperial conference in which Hirohito would be asked not merely to hear the competing positions, but to choose between them. They would put the question directly to Hirohito in a formal conference, and they would ask him not merely to listen, as emperors listen, but to choose. Just before midnight on the 9th of August, the leaders of Japan filed into an air raid shelter beneath the imperial palace. A small, hot, low-ceilinged room, the air heavy with the breath too many exhausted men. Joining the Big Six was one more figure, Baron Hiranuma Chukinchiro, the aged president of the Privy Council, a stern nationalist brought in to give the coming decision the full weight of the state. They stood in formal dress, worn past the point of feeling it, and they waited. The emperor entered. They bowed. He took his seat, and for a long time he did what emperors did. He listened in silence while his ministers made, one last time, the arguments they had already worn down to nothing. Hiranuma pressed them with hard questions, not about the enemy's bombs, but about Japan itself, about the food that was running out, about whether the country could even feed and hold itself together through another winter of war, quite apart from what the Americans and the Soviets might do to it. It was a reminder that the nation was dying from within as surely as it was being killed from without. And then Suzuki did the unthinkable. He rose and he turned to the throne and he asked the emperor for his decision. What Hirohito said in that shelter has come down to us through the memory of the men who were there. He said that he had given long and serious thought to the state of the war at home and abroad, and that he could no longer bear to see his people suffer. He said that to continue now would mean only the destruction of the entire nation and the death of countless more of his subjects. He said that the time had come to bear the unbearable, and he gave his sanction, swallowing his own tears, to the proposal to accept the Allied terms. For centuries, the word of the emperor had been a thing spoken through others, sacred and remote. Now it had come down into a crowded bunker and settled the question that 6 of the most powerful men in the empire could not. Some of the men in that room wept openly. Others stood rigid, staring at nothing. The soldiers who had argued for resistance to the very last did not argue with this. There was no arguing with this. Whatever they felt, and some of them felt it as the collapse of everything they had lived for, the decision had been made by the one voice they had to all sworn before anything else in the world to obey. In the small hours of the 10th of August, Japan's answer went out across the world. It accepted the Potsdam Declaration, with the understanding that its acceptance did not prejudice the prerogatives of the emperor as a sovereign ruler. One condition carried on the back of the emperor's own word. The war, it seemed, was over. It was not over, because that single condition would not survive contact with the enemy unchanged. When the Allied reply came back across the ocean, drafted in Washington by the American Secretary of State, James Behrens, it did not simply say yes. It said that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor to rule would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. Subject to, 2 words, and the wound tore open again. To the peace faction, it was a phrase they could live with, the bitter price of survival, a technicality that is against the life of the nation. To the hardliners, it was proof of everything they had feared. It meant a foreign general standing above the sacred throne. It meant the imperial line itself reduced to something a stranger could command. This, they argued, was not the condition they had agreed to. This struck at the very heart of what made Japan Japan. And so, incredibly, after 2 cities and a Soviet invasion and the emperor's own tearful word, the government slid back toward deadlock. The surrender that had felt final in that midnight shelter was days later coming apart in the daylight. The strain of it was everywhere. On the 11th of August, even as the government wrestled with the Allied reply, a message went out to the army in the name of the war minister himself. It told the soldiers to fight on, doggedly, to the very end. Whether Anami wrote those words to hold his restless officers in check, or because some part of him still meant them, no one can say for certain. Perhaps he did not know himself, but the sacred decision had been made in that shelter, and here was the war minister's name, days later, calling the army to keep fighting. Japan was a nation coming apart at its own seams. It fell to the emperor a second time. On the 14th of August, Hirohito gathered his ministers once more, and once more he made his will plain. He would accept the terms. He would end the war. He asked his generals, some of them in tears, to lay down their arms, and to leave no doubt to reach past his own quarreling government and speak to the nation directly. He agreed to do something no reigning emperor had ever done in the history of Japan. He would record a message in his own voice to be broadcast to all his people. That recording, made in the palace on the night of the 14th, became the single most dangerous object in the country. Technicians from the national broadcaster were brought in secret into the imperial household ministry. The emperor spoke his message into their equipment, and they pressed it onto phonograph records. And those records were hidden away inside the palace complex to wait for noon the next day. Because not everyone would accept the end. That night, a group of army officers, younger men who could not endure the thought of surrender, set in motion a desperate plot to stop it. At their center was a major named Hatanaka Kenji, 33 years old, an officer of the war ministry. He and those with him had convinced themselves of a comforting lie that the emperor did not truly wish to surrender, that he had been surrounded and deceived by weak and treasonous advisors, and that they could only seize the palace and destroy the recording before it aired. The army would rise, the old men would be swept away, and the war would go on. They went first to the man whose blessing they needed above all others, the war minister, Anami Korichika, the one senior officer who had argued longest and hardest for continued resistance. If any general in Japan would join them, surely it was him. Anami would not. And here is the tragedy of the man, the thing that makes him so much harder to judge than a simple villain or a simple hero. Anami still opposed surrender, but he refused to support a rebellion against the emperor's decision. Whatever private sympathy he may have felt for continued resistance, he would not authorize a coup against the throne. His loyalty to the emperor's command ultimately outweighed his own judgment, and he gave the plotters no authority to act in his name. So they went ahead without him. On the night of the 14th, Hatanaka and his fellow officers moved on the imperial palace. They needed the commander of the Guards Division, Lieutenant General Mori Takeshi, 51, to turn his soldiers to their cause. Mori refused, and in a room in the palace complex in the small hours of the morning, Hatanaka shot him dead. With Mori murdered, the rebels forged orders in the dead man's name, sealed off the palace, cut its lines to the outside world, and began to hunt through the darkened halls for the phonograph records that carried the emperor's voice. They searched the household ministry. They interrogated the staff at gunpoint. Elsewhere in Tokyo, other plots moved to widen the revolt, and one party went for the prime minister. Old Suzuki, who had survived assassins once before, 9 years earlier, and carried their bullets in him still, escaped his home minutes before the men arrived to kill him. They burned it behind them, but the recording was never found. It had been hidden among ordinary papers, and in the darkness and the confusion, the rebels searched right past it, and the wider army did not rise. When the commander of the Eastern District Army, General Tanaka Shishizuichi, learned what was happening, he went to the palace himself, confronted the mutineers, and by the sheer force of his authority ordered the guards back to their duty. Without the army behind them, without the records, without Anami, the coup had nowhere left to go. As the hours wore on toward dawn, it collapsed. Hatanaka, his cause lost, rode out into the streets of Tokyo, scattering leaflets to a city that would not listen. And then, before the broadcast he had died to prevent could air, he took his own life. He was not the only one. In the early hours of that same morning, the 15th of August, Anami Korichika put on a clean uniform. He wrote a final message, apologizing with his death for a great crime against the throne, and he performed the ancient ritual of the samurai. He cut into his own body, and he refused all help, and he died slowly in the traditional way, taking the pain as the last duty he had left to give. The strongest voice for war in all of Japan had not fought the surrender. He had submitted to it, and then he had removed himself from the world it was about to make. A day later, the admiral who had built the kamikaze, Onishi Takejiro, unable to live with the thousands of young men he had sent to their deaths for a cause now ending in defeat, followed him. And in the days after, General Tanaka, the man who had put down the coup and held the surrender together through that last long night, would take his own life as well. And then, at noon on the 15th of August, the thing they had died to stop happened. Across the country, in the cities and the fields and the ruins, people gathered around their radios. They went still. For the first time in the long history of Japan, the ordinary people were about to hear the living voice of their emperor. It came through faint and strange, in a formal ancient court language that many of them could barely follow. But the meaning reached them. He spoke of an enemy that had begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, whose power to destroy was beyond all measure. He spoke of the need to bear the unbearable and to endure the unendurable. He told them without ever using the word that the war was lost and they must lay down their arms. And when the broadcast ended, there was silence. The same silence that had begun 9 days earlier, on a bright morning when a single city stopped answering its telephones. It had spread outward from Hiroshima across the whole of Japan, and now it settled over an entire nation hearing, for the first time, that everything they had been asked to die for was gone. Some wept, some knelt, some could not understand at first what they had been told. On the 2nd of September, aboard the American battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender would be signed, and the Second World War would come at last to its end. But the war truly ended in that noonday quiet, in millions of homes, in the sound of a voice that had never before been heard, telling a broken people to put down their weapons and live. The men who had governed Japan had spent their final days learning, one impossible truth at a time, what had happened to Hiroshima. First, the silence they could not break. Then the word, atomic, spoken by their enemy. Then the confirmation from their own scientist, standing in their own ashes. Then a second city and a second cloud and the slow, grinding collapse of every reason they had left to keep fighting. They had argued and denied and calculated and grieved. Some had died rather than accept the end. The institutional deadlock was finally broken by the emperor's intervention. But that intervention came only after Hiroshima, the Soviet declaration of war, the invasion of Manchuria, Nagasaki, the blockade, and the continuing destruction. Japan's cities had stripped away nearly every remaining alternative. The old Japan died with Hiroshima, and what that voice asked of those who survived it was the hardest thing of all. Not to die for the nation, as they had so long been prepared to do, but to go on living in a world that had changed forever in a single flash of light, and to build something new and quieter out of the ashes it left behind.